Welcome to Home Education Matters, the weekly podcast supporting you on your home education journey. Today we are joined by Dr. Naomi Fisher, and I am very excited to have Naomi with us because Naomi is one of those names that is like a kind of, you hear as a mythical figure in the home ed world. No, you're laughing, but it's true. And when I told some of my friends I was interviewing you for my podcast, they were like, oh, like that. And I told a friend of mine who's not at all into home ed, and I said, I'm interviewing this amazing person for my podcast. And he just looked completely blank. And he's into Formula One. And I said, well, imagine that little Formula One podcast you watch. And they had Toto Wolff coming on, who's like the head of Mercedes. He was like, oh, wow. I was like, no, it is that big. So I'm very excited to have you with us.
That's
Naomi,
funny.
I know, you are the Toto Wolff of home ed. Today, Naomi and I are going to be talking a little bit about just autonomy and unschooling, but with an eye to screen use, because I know you've written an article recently about screen use, and I actually did my thesis in social media use. And so I've read quite a lot of research about that kind of thing too. And so I think it could be quite an interesting chat. So Naomi, first of all, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And would you be able to tell us a little bit about yourself for anyone who doesn't know you, which is a bit mad?
Yes.
That would be great. Thank you.
Yes, so I'm a clinical psychologist and I have two children and they have never been to conventional school. So they were home educated from the start and they now attend a self-directed learning community part-time. And I wrote a book a couple of years ago called Changing Our Minds, and that really came out of watching my children learn as they didn't go to school and seeing how very different their learning and their development was to what I had been taught as a psychologist child development was about. And I started, the more I watched them, the more I saw what they were doing and how they were learning, the more I thought there's something really odd about the fact that I have a PhD as well as a doctorate in clinical psychology. I have a PhD in developmental psychology. So I have a lot of training in child development. And in none of it did anybody ever talk about the role of school in child development. They never said, all the studies we learned about this is how children's thinking develops. It never said, but of course, this is in the context of them spending 30 hours a week at school. And it was like school was this invisible intervention into childhood. And as a psychologist, I work individually with children, young people and adults. And if I see somebody for like 20 hours a week, that's thought of as quite a lot. I mean, not 20 hours a week, 20 weeks for 1 hour, so like 20 sessions. That's thought of as quite a lot of intervention. But yet at school, we're putting children in this environment where they're there for 30 hours every week for like 13 years. And we're not really discussing what impact that has on them and what their development might look like if they weren't doing that.
Was all the literature and the developmental studies, was that all based on parent influence and that kind of thing? So it just didn't reference, the sort of the huge amount of time they spend away from the home?
It didn't. Well, it's odd. When they look at child development, they look at things like, how do children develop socially? How do they develop different cognitive skills? At what point do they become able to think in this way? Or at what point in their lives is the kind of play-based learning? When is it all about imaginative play? And then how does it move on? And at no point did it say, for example, let's talk about imaginative play. So there's a lot of literature about how important imaginative play is in the early years, under fives. And we've got nurseries and things are set up for children to do lots of imaginative play in that kind of time. And parents generally know that. You can find lots of stuff about how to encourage imaginative play in young children. And then they get to 5 and imaginative play is progressively sort of de-emphasized in the system. So whereas, in reception classes and nurseries, you'll have a home corner and you'll have a place for them to play that they're digging. As you move up the school, by the time you're in year 2 or 3, you won't have those things anymore. The expectation is that play is left for playtime and that adults don't kind of encourage it in the same way. What adults are doing now is they're encouraging reading and writing and maths. They've sort of shifted their emphasis on what they focus on. And what I observed in my own children and in other children I saw, because of course I was home educating, so I've met lots of other home educated children, was that some children did things in a really different time kind of, what's the word, time scale to others. So I met children who weren't really doing much imaginative play below the age of 5, for example. And then when they got to sort of 8 or 9, it was like something changed, and suddenly they were in this imaginative world. And it was often based on video games that they'd played. So it's interesting, we're going to talk about screens, but I would meet children who were like immersed in the world of Minecraft. And it was all about role play and working things out. And I would listen to my own children playing with other children in Minecraft. And I would hear all these amazing conversations they were having, all these negotiations, all this stuff. And I would think, we talk a lot in psychology about how important the skills that children learn in imaginative play are in those really early years. We don't really talk at all about how important imaginative play, particularly via video games, might be in 7, 8, 9, 10-year-olds, because it's almost like it's invisible.
I'm guessing that's because it's not in the school system. So
it's not in the school system.
They would never
anymore.
look into it.
Exactly. It just isn't part of the way we think about childhood in the same way. And I just thought, wow, that's really interesting. But also, what if lots of children are actually missing out on really important developmental stages because the school system channels them into what they should be doing? So, by the time you're 8 or 9, if you talk to a child who goes to school by 8 or 9, they will have learned that there's work, learning, and there's play, and the two things are different, and play is less valuable. Play is what we do at playtime or what we do when we finished our homework. It's not the kind of the main thing of childhood. And if you meet home educated children who've never gone to school, they don't learn that. They never learn that. So they never get to that stage where they're like, this is my work, this is my play. Play isn't so important. And I was like, well, isn't that mind-blowing, actually, to see these children learning so differently? And what if there's something really important, particularly for some kids, having this stage where your parent will still encourage you to really play and will help you play and will encourage you to play, and that could still be the main part of your learning, even though you're maybe now 9 or 10 or 11 or 12.
It would be fantastic if there was some sort of longitudinal study where they took where they compared children, because my children are now 14 and 16 and they've never been to school. My son's now doing his A-levels from home, which is challenging. And they still imaginatively play together. Now, most teenage children, they can't even stand each other, but my two still play. And just as you say, it was triggered by watching Star Wars when they're about 8. And from then on, we still, all of us, even now together, they come and say, do you want to play First Order with us? And we all, and I play a character and they play characters. And even at this age, when my son is now strappingly taller than me, we all play. And actually, I remember the very first time it happened, and very like you say, it was when they were a little bit older. So they're about 7 or 8 when all of this kicked off, and we watched The Great Escape. And they decided that they were then going to play The Great Escape as their imaginative play. And they were quite young, 7 or 8, and they would embody different characters. So one of them would be a Nazi, and one of them would be the Holtz or whatever the prisoner was. And wherever we went, they would be playing this game, which, as you can imagine, was deeply embarrassing. Because one of them would be shouting in a kind of Germanic voice. And it was. But even then, I never stopped them, because as far as I was concerned, it's just such a valuable thing, isn't it? Imaginative play, especially between siblings, is lovely, isn't it?
So amazing. And that's so interesting that they're carrying on. And I think that's another great example of how, when I was talking about school being this invisible intervention, I think it's a way children learn things like, it's time to stop playing now. I've had children say that to me. Oh, I'm too old to play now. I can't play now. I've got to do my work. They're just, and we don't even think about them learning those messages. That isn't something that comes into our discourse. So if you talk to, if you looked at sort of developmental psychology literature, there won't be anything. Oh, well, I may be wrong, but I have never seen anything about imaginative play in teenagers. Whenever I look at it, I don't find anything about it.
I think they just don't do it.
They don't. Well, actually, you know what? I think they kind of do. But I think they do it through video games.
Yeah, they do it in a different way.
They do it in a different way, and we don't value what they do. We don't value teenage play, older children's play in a really different way to younger children. As I say, there are whole websites devoted to how to set up imaginative play for your younger children. How to set up small world play and how to set up invitations to play and all that kind of thing. Whereas with teenagers, it's all about how to stop them spending all their time playing. Actually, we denigrate the kind of playing that they're drawn to. Typically.
Is that because you think it's generationally different for us? So because it's not the kind of play that we did, do you think if they were trying to think what play I did, but I just kind of, hung around on street corners, that kind of thing. And
Yeah.
and if they did that, do you think we would feel a bit more happy about it? Because in actual fact, now I think about it, I seem to recall that when teenagers do that, they put on loud alarms that only teenagers can hear and things like that to scatter them like herds of animals.
When they're in street corners.
Yeah, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
They put on those alarms that only teenage ears can hear, which is just inhumane.
It's
beyond
odd,
anything,
isn't it? I think
it's
we do have a strange relationship with teenagers in our society. We do tend to denigrate them a lot, and we do tend to try and control them. I think there are some things that are more valued than others, like board games, which are obviously rigid and much more rule bound than imaginative play. But generally, if you think of the way in which teenagers play, so there's not just video games, there are things like role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons, that kind of thing is also play. But again, it's kind of seen as geeky. It's seen as, not a worthwhile use of their time. It's odd how much we just totally don't value what they're learning and what they're getting out of that kind of thing. We think that they should be focused on the curriculum.
I wonder if that is partly because some of these things like Dungeons and Dragons or video games are quite solitary, or at least physically solitary, in as much as they're not physically with other people. And also they tend to be indoors. You can do them in like a little corner of your bedroom. And I think as parents, we sort of, I don't know, all our alarm bells go if our teenager spends too long in their bedroom.
That's true. I mean, Dungeons and Dragons is real life. You can get together with a group of people. People are doing it all over the place, getting together and playing. And of course, but that's another interesting thing, isn't it? Because if you think about the kinds of play that we value and the kinds of play that we don't value, outdoor play is often really highly valued. Outdoor unstructured play, often people, I think lots of home educators have this idea that let children loose in the forest and they'll play and play and play and they'll make amazing dens. They'll all be wonderful. And that's great for some children, not all children, and a certain time in their lives. But at some point, most of them get to the point where they're like, actually, I need something a bit more here. I need something a bit different. And that's understandable. If you put me outside in a forest all day and said, play and create things, I would actually be like, you know what? I'd rather read a book. I'd rather do other things. And I think we have trouble with that transition. So we kind of value that kind of play, but then we don't value the other things that older kids might want to do in the same way.
I found that as my children got a little older, that when they were younger, they were very interested in how things worked. So going to a forest, yes, building stuff, constructing, deconstructing quite often as well. And as they got older, my daughter became much more interested in how people work, and my son became much more interested in how society works. And so all of their gameplay now seems to be based on role playing with where my daughter's concerned, and where my son's concerned, it's things like strategy games and those kind of risk-based games. And I wonder if partly it's that shift where they previously would go into a forest and make things with pine cones. Now they want to see how other people would respond to different scenarios.
That's a really interesting point, because I think play is a place where we can experiment with ideas. And the ideas that we're experimenting with are different at different stages in our lives, aren't they? So very young children are experimenting with all sorts of social stuff, but it's quite often, the things they play about are the things they see. They play about school. Even home educated children play about school, and they play about birthday parties, and they hope, they play what's happening in their lives. And then as they get older, the stage widens for them. The way they see the world widens, and so their play gets dramatically more complex as well. But they're still, just play is such a great place to explore things like that. My son is also really into strategy. He's always been into strategy, and he's always been into mysteries. So in fact, you're talking about your children playing about being Nazis. My son has had an ongoing interest in murder mysteries since he was really young. We have a funny book he wrote when he dictated it, and my sister-in-law wrote it down for him when he was about 6, and it's called Murder Isn't Funny. And basically, for a long time, everything he did was about murder mysteries and death. And he's still really interested in that. He's read all of Agatha Christie, and he loves kind of, escape rooms, solving stuff. And it's just like, play is such a great way to explore all of those ideas. And actually, so creative, such a creative place to explore it, I think, play, because it's so different, say, reading an Agatha Christie where it's all there for you, to doing something where you yourself are maybe creating strategic situations or solving mysteries. You're part of it in a way that you're just not when you're reading a book.
For someone who's very comfortable with their home education journey, I can see why you sort of approach that as, my son is exploring his existential identity and it's all wonderful. But for somebody who may be a little more insecure about home education, they may feel that they're being judged by other people because their child is like obsessed by death, and they may think, I really want to respect his rights to pursue this as an interest, but could he choose something else that people don't judge me on?
Wouldn't it be great? And I definitely wasn't confident. Now my children are 11 and 14, so again I can sort of see how it's followed through, but I definitely couldn't when he was 5 or 6. And we had a long stage where the only game he wanted to play was real life Plants versus Zombies. I don't know if you know Plants versus Zombies. Yes. But basically you have plants and you have zombies, and the plants shoot at and kill the zombies. So I used to have to be the plant, he used to have to be the zombie. I had to sit there going boom, 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 boom at one point, and he would slowly die. And that was what he would want to do.
Shakespearean style.
Yes, it was a bit like that, because that's what it's like with the zombies, right? They get wounded, then they get wounded a bit more, then they get wounded a bit more, and then finally they die. Their bucket comes off their head, there's all sorts of stuff that happens. Yeah, so... But it definitely wasn't like that at the beginning. I mean, I think, writing my book was very much a process of watching what was happening with my children and with the other children I saw, and thinking, how does this all connect with my psychology training? How does this? Because I think there's so much here which isn't being talked about in the mainstream. When the mainstream talks about child development or how children learn, we're just not talking about it, because home education is kind of off there in this silo where what people think it is so different, I think, to what it really is. But also the mainstream just isn't really interested in how children learn. They think they know how children learn. They think they know how children learn at school. And I think they all assume that what we're doing at home is basically just school, except probably a bit less well, because they're only on their own. That's what they imagine. And so they don't know that actually you look at these children and you're like, wow, this is what happens when you don't put someone into school for 30 hours a week. And it's really different.
You see, I mean, I've got a theory about school that is basically that as the children get older, schools have to be able to quantify who the child is in a way, in order just to be able to justify their existence as a school. And so imagination and play is so difficult to quantify that it just becomes relegated. It's interesting you talk about zombies and imaginative play, because my daughter is now working towards her English language IGCSE.
Yeah.
And there's a part about creative writing, which surely is when you're allowed to really let your imagination go wild. But no, because she wants to write about zombies. And in all the literature and all the mark schemes, it says, don't write about zombies, because children always want to write about zombies. And so, and examiners, and you think, well, if they want to write about it, it's telling us something rather wonderful. But no, apparently, it's the thing that all children want to write about. So they don't like people writing about zombies. But it's a perfect example of how they want you to be imaginative right up until the end of their boundary of when they don't want you to be any more imaginative than that.
They want you to be imaginative within their prescribed boundaries. And I think that's the way that school works generally. Like, they want you to be asking questions and engaged, but only about what you're meant to be being taught right now. So you're sitting in your maths class, they want you to be, thinking about it creatively, but it has to be within the maths shaped box. You can't be thinking about why animals developed with lots of them have 4 legs, for example, and others have 2 legs. You can't go off on that rabbit trail, whereas you can as home educators. So that's why everything connects to each other. And I think there's something really, really powerful and magic that happens when children are allowed to continue with that kind of learning, where things follow rabbit trails, rather than now we're doing maths, now we're doing English, now we're doing history, and they all exist within these boxes, and you mustn't think outside the box, because that would be you going off topic.
A lot of that is from a practical perspective, where if you have 35 children in a classroom all going off on tangents, you've got chaos, right? So
absolutely,
it would be fun chaos, but it would be chaos.
But the interesting thing is, you see, that they manage that in early years. So our school, people always say this to me, we can't do this, it's not possible, it's not programmed. But you look at early years, in lots of ways, the principles of a good early years setting are, I think, the principles of home education, how young people learn, that you basically go to a good nursery, they will be setting up different things for children to learn based on their knowledge of the children. And they will actually change. I've known nurseries that they've had children who are really interested in fish, and they've developed whole displays about fish, or they're really interested in diggers, so they go down the digger route. It's a bit like the zombies. If young children are interested in zombies, they'll help them explore that interest in zombies. And then they allow the children to choose. So nobody says, come on, you've got to learn about fish now because everybody's learning about fish. That's the only thing. We give them autonomy within that setting. And we give them autonomy about other things, like we give them autonomy usually to go to the toilet when they want. Often in a good nursery, they can go outside if they want and come inside when they want. And then as they get older, we do that less and less and less, to the point where by the time they're 14 or 15, people say, I couldn't let our teenagers go to the toilet. It would be mayhem. It's like, so what are we doing between the 4-year-olds and the 15-year-olds where they can't do that stuff now, but they could then?
Is that some sort of fear response, do you think? I don't know, some sort of fear-based thing where they're worried that as the children get older and bigger, they're more outnumbered? Because I know I taught briefly, and it's quite scary teaching secondary, because I'm 5'4", and everyone was all the guys, all the boys who were like only 11 or 12, they were bigger and a bit rowdy, and it is physically quite intimidating when you're alone in a classroom with sort of 35 strapping men, in effect.
Yes, I think it's something to do with the fact that we think in schools that we must control what children learn, and we must make them do certain things no matter what the children think. So that becomes increasingly difficult as they get older. So in secondary school, in order to make them follow the curriculum, which school comes about as this is the most important thing, learning this curriculum, you have to have a high level of control to get them to do that. So that's why it feels intimidating to you, because you are having to control this class of 30, 35 young people, most of whom would probably rather not be here and would probably rather not be doing the things that you're trying to get them to do, which is a really difficult position if you think about it. And that's, I think, the heart of where I think we've gone wrong in education, that we've assumed that the way that young people have to learn how to be adults in the world is through us making them do things for 13 years. And I think that's again what we see in home education. And it was another thing that really blew my mind when I started seeing it, how I don't know if you know the research of Alan Thomas looking at home education. So he did this study looking at, it's called How Children Learn at Home. He published a book with Harriet Patterson. And he basically went and stayed at lots of home educators' homes and looked at what was going on. And he's a psychologist, he thought he was going to find parents teaching children. And that's what he was interested in. He thought he was going to see one-to-one teaching. Then he found that they weren't really teaching their children. Mostly it was about conversation. It was about all the things that we know happen as home educators. It was about life. It was about exploring things. It was about helping the children follow their interests. And he sort of talks about how there's this kind of pseudo-scientific process that goes on where in schools the adult has the power, young people don't. Young people's only real power is to do what they're told or not do what they're told. Whereas at home, if the parent is trying to teach the child something and the child's like, I'm not interested, or I'm just not here, the parent probably isn't going to carry on, because there's no point in doing that in a one-on-one situation. They're probably going to say, okay, we'll back off from this for a while, we'll try it again later. Or so there's a kind of more dynamic process between children and their parents. But what I found so interesting looking at how other children became teenagers, is that as they became teenagers, when they hadn't gone through this process of being made to do things and controlled, they had this inner sense of themselves as the people who drove their learning, and that they wanted to do things. They were started to be capable of looking forward to the future and thinking things like, okay, I'd quite like to go to university. What am I going to need to do that? I'm going to need to do GCSEs. Okay, how might that happen? And that's so different to what happens in school, where it's like everybody's going to do these GCSEs because that's what you do when you're 16. And I think there's just something so fundamentally different about that, which you can't really get until you see it happening. That people say all the time to me with younger children, what about GCSEs? Aren't you worried about GCSEs? And I'm like, I'm not going to make them do these things, but why wouldn't I trust them to want to find their way in the world? to want to, whether that includes GCSEs or not. Why would I suddenly lose trust in them as they get to the age of 16 and suddenly say, right, sorry guys, I've got to force you to do things now, having not done that all the way along and seen them all the way along learning things in a way which I hadn't really anticipated.
Is there a concern that if you allow the child to take their own time and take their own routes and make their own decisions, that they might turn around at 19, having not been interested, and suddenly say, do you know what, I'd like to be a doctor, I'm going to apply to university, and you're like, well, you haven't got any GCSEs, buddy, so that's a bit tricky.
So I would say that, of course, that's always a possibility, but it's also the case that people go through the whole of school, don't get GCSEs. 30% of young people don't get GCSEs when they go through school. They also might get to the age of 19 and go, hang on a minute, actually, I wanted to be a doctor. It's not impossible. There are graduate medical things. I mean, I don't know if you know the work of Sarah J. Blakemore on neuroscience. So her work is really interesting because she's a specialist in the adolescent brain, okay, in the neuroscience of adolescent brains. And she's written a book called Inventing Ourselves. She's a professor of neuroscience. And she's nothing to do with unschooling or anything, or home education or anything like that. She's a neuroscientist. But she talks about how adolescence is now thought about as a period that goes from the age of about 11, sort of puberty, through to actually the age of about 25. And then when we look at the brain development that's going on, that is a period of intense brain development. Lots of things are changing. And that means that it's a period of intense opportunity, but also vulnerability. A bit like the under threes. So we all know that this period under 3 is really important to, that we need to really care for our children and nurture them at that stage in their lives. And she's saying this older period is really important too, but we treat it completely differently. Instead, what we do is we put them under really high pressure and make them all do exams at 16, which if you think about adolescence as going to the age of 25, 16 is really early on in adolescence. And she says, at 16, children's level of brain development is just massively different in the same way as it is when they're 4. Some of them will be years ahead neurologically and some of them will be years behind. So it's not really fair to test them all at 16 and say, this exam is going to define you in some way for the rest of your life. And she says that really people need a really good second chances in their late adolescence, by which she means the early 20s. And actually, when you start to think about it, it makes sense to me. I'm like, yeah, I can see how some people really, in their teens, they're quite clearly dealing with lots of stuff. There's quite clearly loads of emotional things going on. It's not really the right time for them to be taking these exams, which are so important. But actually, by the time they come through to their early 20s, things are starting to calm down a bit.
Plus university as well. I always thought university was wasted on 18-year-olds.
Yes, it's too early, isn't it? Wouldn't it be better if they could do it when they're ready? If when you're ready to do GCSEs is when you're 19. My ideal would be that it just isn't an issue. You know what I mean? That isn't seen as behind. It's just like, okay, now you'd like to do GCSEs, and the odds are that you'd be able to do them fairly efficiently at that point, because you won't be doing them because you're being made to do them. You'll be doing them because you want to do them. And of course, you don't have to do 9 GCSEs like you do at school. You just have to do the number that enables you to get to the next level. And also the strange thing about things like medicine or all other kind of professional courses is actually once you're past the school age, there are ways to get into them which aren't quite as cumbersome as doing GCSEs and doing the A levels. There are often access courses. There are all sorts of different ways around these things, which people often aren't very aware of.
I think they don't want children to be aware of them in their teens, because then they might take those alternative routes.
No, I think you're right, actually. And one of the things I often talk about, which I think is really cruel, is that there isn't enough. I don't think teenagers are informed about the fact that 30% of young people fail GCSEs, and that's kind of how the system's designed. So they can't all be successes at GCSE. That isn't going to happen. And yet what they're told at school is these GCSEs are the most important thing you're going to do in your life. If you fail them, you're a failure. Be a catastrophe for you. You will be a failure. And what I see, because I'm a clinical psychologist, I see people who are struggling with their mental health. I see teenagers who believe that, who really believe it, and they know that it's unlikely they're going to do really well at GCSE, because by the time they're 13 or 14, people know. And they think that's effectively going to be the end of their life. So they don't just think, I'm going to, I might do badly at GCSE. They think, and that will mean that I'll never have an interesting job. It will mean, I've had teenagers tell me that they've been told that people end up homeless if they don't have GCSEs. It's like, why? I can see why teachers are saying that. They're saying it to try and motivate them. But the impact on young people is horrible.
It's like a push-pull factor, isn't it? You're motivating by fear
You're motivating by fear, exactly. And what's so cruel about it is that it's a system where they can't all win. So that 30% of those young people, the fear option is going to come true for them because that's how the system works.
Yeah. We interrupt this broadcast to remind you to like and subscribe to our podcast. And don't forget to join our Home Education Matters Facebook group, where you can find details on all our podcasts, any links or resources mentioned, chat to our guests, request upcoming podcasts, and even come on the podcast yourself. Do join us over there. I wanted to bring us back to one thing you mentioned about vulnerability and about how sort of adolescents between 11 and 25, they are at quite a vulnerable stage of their development. And I was thinking about screen use, and because we've always had a very autonomous house here, and I let the children play for as long as they want. I let them wake up when they want, shower when they want, whatever. It's completely up to them. But the one thing I have restrictions on is screen use. And I've always had restrictions on screen use. And I continue to have restrictions on screen use, even though they're now, as I say, 14 and 16. And I think a lot of that control over that one element is because I have an awareness of a certain amount of vulnerability, that they're at this vulnerable age where they're exposed to many things, but perhaps not yet equipped to deal with them. So I wonder what you feel about that kind of element when it comes to screen use. Is there a sense that they are vulnerable and so we need to not control but protect? And is there a line you can draw between those two words, control and protect?
That's such an interesting question, because I think that kind of runs through a lot of the way we think about childhood, doesn't it? If children are vulnerable, do we need to put up firm boundaries in place to protect them? So I think there are some things we clearly need to do that with, like, cars. We can't let them run in front of cars. That has to be a hard boundary. Things like technology, I think, are a bit different, because I think there's something here about a process of learning how to use them and learning how to make decisions about them. And well, when we put a boundary around that's a very firm boundary, that can be appropriate at a certain time in children's lives, but we do actually stop them. If we take all responsibility for it, we stop them learning how to take responsibility for it themselves. So if we always prevented a child from crossing the road, for example, always up to teenagers, they're actually not learning how to cross the road. They're just learning how to do what they're told around cars. And with things like screens, and it's not just screens, it's other things as well, I think we obviously there has to be a stepping back so that children can start to make those decisions for themselves, because that's what they're going to be doing as adults. And that the control is going to run out at some stage. At some stage, the ban will have gone, the limits will have gone. So it's like, how do we get to a point where they are taking control for these things for themselves? So I think that always needs to be at the back of our heads. You know what I mean? That any strategy which is like, no, this is a ban, is going to expire, and how are we going to deal with that expiring? And also, how can we create a situation where children are practicing the skills that they're going to need as adults in childhood and adolescence? Because this is one of the things I think that goes wrong in our school system, which is that we control children and adolescents in the belief that we're helping them develop self-control. This is what people will often say. They often get mixed up between self-control and being controlled. So, for example, they'll talk about young people who have good self-discipline at school being those who do their homework or those who get to class on time. So complying with the demands of school is equated with self-discipline or self-control. But actually, that isn't what it is. That is about doing what somebody else tells you. And ultimately, what we want from our young people is that they are able to regulate themselves and to take control of their own lives, do things. And I think what you see, a lot of the problem we see, I think, in universities, because going to university is a time of high vulnerability for lots of young people. Their mental health often takes a really serious dip at that point. And I think part of it is that they don't have any practice in making decisions for themselves And then suddenly they get to university. It's like now every decision is up to me. You know, no one's going to chase me if I don't go to classes. No one's going to chase me if I don't write my essays. No one's going to make sure I eat healthy food. It's all suddenly up to me. And it's a bit like throwing them in a deep end. So whenever I talk to parents, I'm always saying, how can we help? How can you make the space for your children to be making those decisions whilst they are still under your roof and whilst you're still there to pick them up when things go wrong? Because I would rather that my 10 or 11 or 12-year-old is making poor decisions that I can help them with than my 23-year-old is making poor decisions because it's the first time they've actually had any power to make decisions.
Yeah, I absolutely see that. I think from my perspective, when it comes to certain screen use, not all screen use, it's letting them flex their muscles can expose them to many things. Like my daughter, she got an Instagram account when she was 13, and I put restrictions on, but not enough. And within 2 weeks, she was getting loads of inappropriate photos. Now she is now 14, and she is savvy as anything. She blocks people. She's very good, but she did not have to go through a baptism of fire to become that savvy. And part of me thinks and she learned a lot for sure, and she can navigate things now, but she was young to be learning that.
Yeah, that's very young. No, I agree. And I think two things. One, I think you do have to say at some point, this is something I'm going to limit. I often tell the story of my daughter who I found watching a pornographic cartoon on YouTube when she was 4. And it wasn't so she couldn't read, she hadn't chosen it. It came up in the feed, basically. She was just choosing the next Peppa Pig cartoon and it came up. And I said to her, you can't watch YouTube anymore by yourself at all. I'm going to take it off all your devices. If you want to watch YouTube, well, you and I could do it together. You can watch, whatever it was, iPlayer, children's iPlayer. I will put things onto you that I know are safe for you at this stage. And she was very upset about that. She went ballistic. And I just held it because I was like, I can't keep you safe. And I think there's something here about where are they safe and how much safety, what sort of exposure should they be having at this age? And for me, pornographic cartoons is an absolute. It was a cartoon, so it wasn't real. But it was a call for me that this is not an environment in which I can keep her safe. And for example, my daughter doesn't have a phone. She's 11, nearly 12. I'm not going to be getting her a phone for a while because I don't think she can cope with the level of kind of immediate intrusion into her sort of personal space all the time. I see that she can't manage that. So I wouldn't do that right now. And
that's interesting. So you control screen use to a degree by just not exposing them to certain gadgets, I suppose.
I think it's that I look at, can I keep you safe enough here? And if I can't, then we're just not going to have that right now. But that when we do, I'm going to be right there with you and try and be involved with it with you and helping you learn. And at some point, my son actually does have a smartphone. He's 14. I don't have any concerns about his ability to manage that. Do you see what I mean? So it's like you're curating, you're always curating the space for them. That's how education, that's how home education, that's how parenting works. You are choosing what we allow into this space and what we don't allow into this space. And I absolutely don't think there's any reason why children or young teenagers should be exposed to porn or need to be exposed to porn. It's just a limit it's a legal limit for a start, but I don't have a problem with that. I just think that's safeguarding.
What about those kind of grey areas where you have, things on TikTok or Instagram that just that you maybe find offensive or sexist or whatever, but really aren't pornography? But is that just basically a conversation to be had with the child at that point or the teenager? So
basically my policy there would be, it's individual. Okay, so I work individually with young people. I don't think you can predict necessarily. As a parent, your child best. I have met some children who have been really negatively affected by videos on TikTok, for example. And actually, we know there's a whole really interesting field at the moment about social contagion via TikTok. I don't know if you know about this from your masters, but during the pandemic, it looks like lots of teenagers have developed Tourette's-like symptoms. Did you know about this? As a result of seeing influencers on TikTok doing Tourette's, so showing their tits. So I think there is something very powerful about social media and influencing, but I do think it's an individual thing. I don't think there can be a blanket rule for everybody. But I think the basic principles that I would have was, A, you try and get in there with your child so you know what they're looking at, you know what they're doing, and you try and establish a trusting relationship so that they feel able to bring things to you. I think that's the key thing going forwards all the way through it. That if they are scared that they're going to show something to you and your reaction is going to be, well, I told you not to go on TikTok, or I thought, then they won't bring it to you.
Or that you'll say, well, that's it, you're banned from TikTok.
Exactly. Or you're going to react really reactively and say no, which is kind of what I did, I have to say, with YouTube. But she was 4, so it was a kind of different scenario. I wouldn't do that now as a 4. But if she said, I want a smartphone now, I would have a conversation with her about how difficult she finds some aspects of chatting with her friends really online. She finds some of those things really difficult, and what it's like to have that in your pocket. So you can never get away from it. Whereas right now she chats with her friends on her iPad, and then she leaves that, and then that's it. It's kind of, she can get away from it. So I would have that conversation with her. It wouldn't be a, no, I'm not letting you do this until you're this age. It would be, okay, I have these concerns about that, and I wonder what that would be like. And I would try and make it an open dialogue with her, with the knowledge that at some point that is going to change. Do you see what I mean? That it's it's hard. I guess it's a dynamic process. I think it's a really dynamic process between children and adults. But I do think that sometimes, as a parent, you do need to be ready to say, I'm sorry, you can't manage this safely, and I can't keep you safe here. And so it's my responsibility as a parent to stop you from this. And I mean, it's horrible. A horrible 13-year-olds being sent inappropriate messages on Instagram is horrible. And there's no reason why I don't think as a parent you have to be okay with that. It's absolutely not okay on every level. If they're not at a stage where they can protect themselves, like, she couldn't read, she wasn't at a stage where she could choose what she was watching. I'm not going to make her vulnerable in that way.
I found, as a parent who's spent, sort of the last 13, 14 years with their children, sort of always focusing on autonomy and having discussions always about everything. So everything was a multilateral decision.
Yeah.
I found it very difficult, and I still find it very difficult, to just go barging in and say, do you know what, I can't keep you safe on this. You can't go on Instagram anymore. I find it goes against everything I feel I am as a parent. So even now, I sort of we have limits, exactly like you say. So she doesn't have this sort of, like, I nearly said weapon, but it feels like that sometimes. A phone in her pocket that is full of this stuff. It stops at 6 p.m, for example, so she doesn't have it sort of late into the night on her own in her room. But part of me feels even that is, how is she going to build up her self-control to turn her phone off if I'm turning it off for her?
I think that's a valid question for yourself, because at some point you're going to have to hand that responsibility over to her. So at some point it is going to be her choosing. And it may well be that when you do hand that responsibility over to her, she will then make the decision that you have wanted her to make for a while. So I think, parents often think there'll be a sort of smooth segue from you saying we stop at 6 to her taking over, and then she'll stop at 6 herself, or she'll stop at 8 herself. More likely she won't. She'll go through that period of, I can now watch it all evening and see what happens. And she has to go through that learning process for herself. Do you see what I mean? I think it's a difference between thinking that you're establishing habits for them, which they'll carry on with, which in my experience doesn't really work so much, as a point of, there is going to be a point where she's going to have to work that out for herself. She's going to have to work that relationship out with her for herself. And it's a real gradual dance, isn't it, between parents? But I know exactly what you mean about those, when you're putting a hard boundary when that isn't what you usually do. I think that's really hard. And it's really when it comes down to safety that I think sometimes parents have to step in and do that. And I suppose I work with young people who have quite serious mental health problems sometimes. It's really hard. Like, sometimes there's a kind of almost addictive quality in the way that they relate to social media in particular. And we all know that, because I don't know about it, most people know what it can be like to have that. And then you need to be, as your adult, you need to be able to see that, but also you need also not to be able to overreact. It's so delicate. There's no because you need to. They're going to need to deal with these things in life, and whilst you have the hard boundaries in place, they're not actually learning how to do that on their own terms. and there might be appropriate for some things at certain points, but it's always going to be moving towards them making more choices, because that's what you want to happen, isn't it? You want them to grow up as people who can do this for themselves.
And you're right, I think that it's a dance, and that you're constantly sort of balancing and weighing up these things. But it is tiring as a home educator because obviously, it's, you're doing it all the time. You never farm it out to anybody else. It's always just you doing it. And one thing I wanted to ask you actually was when I was doing my thesis, I discovered that it was on social media use, and I discovered that a lot of the research now says that it's not what platform you're using so much as how you're interacting when you're on the platform. So if you're very actively engaged, it's actually very good. It makes you feel great. But if you're just passively scrolling, it's really rubbish. And I wonder whether there's an element, because I know we were talking about social media use, and you seem pretty relaxed about having certain circumstances where you're like, well, no, you're not old enough and it's just not right, and I can't keep you safe. Whereas perhaps compared to gaming, you might be a bit more relaxed about. I wonder, do you draw a distinction between how people are using, what platforms they're using and how they're using their screen time?
I think I draw a distinction between the effect it has on the person rather than exactly what it is. So if, for example, my children are doing a lot of time on their screens, and I'm seeing that they are not enjoying it and they're not happy about it. So to give another example, when my son was younger, he had a period of being totally into these games on the iPad which are basically free games, right? So this was quite early on in the sort of when tablets started being a thing. There were lots of free games. Basically, in order to progress in the free games, you had to spend money, and it had to be real money. You had to get gems. And each of these games advertised other games to you. So we at one point had 27 of these games on the iPad, all of which were freemium games, none of which you could really make much progress in unless you were spending money. And they were tedious games. They were utterly tedious, because basically the point of the game was to make you spend their money on it. And I realized that he was basically in a state of frenzy all day. He was spending all of his pocket money, any other money he got, on the gems for these games. And he was spending his whole day asking me, when can I have more money? When can I have, this is when he was quite young. He wasn't able to really hold in mind money every week. When am I going to have more money? When am I going to have more money? When am I going to have more money? And I said to myself, this use here is not making anybody happy. It's making me miserable. It's making him miserable. He's not old enough to understand what's going on here. I had a conversation with him about it. So I was like, okay, so what could we do? I was trying to be all collaborative. How could we have, what could we do here? How could, and he said, I know, we could just stop paying electricity, and then the money could come and we could use it on the iPad.
That's
and I was like,
a gorgeous child solution, isn't it?
So we know the level we're working at here. Okay. We know where he is in his mentality. He might have £5 and he gets given, and it will go like that on these games, because that's how it works. It'll just speed up the progress of the building a house by 2 hours or something ridiculous. So I put in a hard ban about that. I said, I'm sorry, this isn't making me happy. It's not making you happy. And I don't think you can yourself stop to say you want to stop about this. So I said, but what I do whenever I do something like that, and it hasn't happened very often in our lives, is I try and find other ways to meet the need. So like with my daughter, I didn't want her watching YouTube on her own. So I found other ways that she could explore iPlayer, for example, in an environment which I was confident was not going to come up with pornographic cartoons. So in his case, I was like, okay, so what's he really enjoying here? He likes certain elements of these games. He likes the kind of building an empire element. So I am going to look really intensely for games that I can pay for, that I'll just buy, where he can get that same kind of experience. And I'm going to put those on his iPad instead. So do you see what I mean? So it wasn't just that I was saying, no, we can't do that. I was saying, okay, so there's a need you're meeting here. I'm going to help you meet that need in a different way.
It's interesting that you mentioned about being responsive to each child and how they react to, when they're being made unhappy. Like your son there was it wasn't making him happy, but he was still ploughing on it with it. I had a similar circumstance with my son, who's never been at all really interested in tech or games. And we started doing Prodigy Maths. Have you heard of it? It's like a very gamification of maths.
Yeah.
And he loves maths. He's very good at maths, loves it. And he was about 10, and he would play it, but he hated it at the same time. But he kept playing it and kept hating it. And afterwards, he would come off.
And stuff?
Yeah, I think he just found the whole process of the maths and the game and the not getting the spells that he needed or whatever. And he would come off this game. I've never seen him like it since. Never seen it. Just exhausted, like, you know, like someone who's been to work at a really hard job that they hate all day, and then they come home. He was like that after playing 2 hours, and then about half an hour later, he'd be like, "Can I play again?" And it'd be like, "This is not like what is happening." So in the end, I did a kind of hard no, much like you said. I said, "Look, you can game and you can do maths, but doing them together is clearly not something you're enjoying." So
no, and then I think you can open up a conversation. And we actually had a similar experience when my son was younger with an app called Education City, which somebody gave us this kind of 3-month trial on. My son also really likes maths. He's always really liked maths. And this Education City game, you had to get all of the maths problems perfectly right in order to get 3 stars at the end of the whatever session it was. And immediately I was like, not really. This seems like a really bad way to learn maths, to have to get everything right all the time. You know, it's always testing. The moment my son worked out that if he got 1 wrong, he would only get 2 stars at the end, he didn't want to do the maths anymore. He wanted me to do the maths, because he was like, it perfectly makes sense if you think about it in gamification terms. He wants to get it's shifted the emphasis from doing the maths, which he really liked and was really fun, to I want to get the stars at the end, because then I get this lovely thing, you know, with fireworks and blah, 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 blah. And I think that's all part of how school sees childhood, that we need to motivate children with these things. We need to set up the rewards. And I just think that's not helpful at all. But I think there are things like that, and actually they're kind of being seduced into it. The children are being seduced into it, you know, because they're designed to keep them playing it. And if they're not getting anything out of it, then, and I also think for some children, sometimes a hard no is easier to deal with than a soft no.
Yeah,
it depends on the
sometimes.
child. You know, and there are sometimes, it depends entirely on the child. Some children can manage a kind of, or we can use it a bit. But my children couldn't. They could not manage they couldn't manage, for example, with the gems, my son could not manage every week you'll have a certain amount of money which you can spend on the gems. That was just awful for him. And actually he was so much happier once we were like, there won't be any gems at all. I
think a lot of that nuance comes with age as well, doesn't it? Where you can have these slightly more gradual boundaries when they get a bit
and that's
older.
happened. So for both of them now, so they watch YouTube now, because I am confident that they are able to manage it now. They're able to navigate it. The same with gems. If they wanted now to do a game like that, I would be confident that they would be able to kind of take that bird's eye view on it and think, okay, hang on a minute. They would have for a start, they just have some understanding of the value of money, which he didn't have at the time. You know, for him, there was no real difference between actual money, which I was putting onto the iPad, and pretend money in the game. There just wasn't that distinction. Whereas now there is. And that's just, you know, that's part of sort of expanding the protective circle, I think. But I do think that sometimes and actually quite a lot of the time when I talk to parents, sometimes I feel like I'm kind of giving them permission to say, no, actually, that's not okay. We're going to stop there. We're not going to do that.
Yeah.
And then the child will get very upset. That's the other thing people often
say. And then parents find that hard, don't they? Yeah. Because then their child is crying or sort of like slamming doors, and you feel that the relationship is being ruined, and you've done it.
Yes, but part of being a parent is keeping your child safe. And you have to, it's never easy, it's never obvious. And it's always a dance, and you're going to get it wrong sometimes. Sometimes you might put in a boundary, and afterwards you're like, actually, we didn't need to have that. I've overreacted, or actually that's my fear here rather than my appraisal of the situation. But I think that's okay. You know, it's rupture and repair. It's not about parenting, isn't about never upsetting your child or never getting anything wrong. It's about repairing things when you do, and holding. I think there's something about parents being able to hold that space where they say, sometimes it's I'm going to have to do things that are going to be upsetting for you. Just in the same way as when they're 2 or 3, you grab their hand and you pull them out the road. Even if they are screaming and kicking, you say, I'm really sorry, but I can't let you do that.
One thing you mentioned there was about rewarding learning. So people don't have that kind of internal motivation to learn, and school is very big on that, so obviously you do the maths and you get the stars kind of thing. And
Yeah.
one thing I've noticed, that a lot of parents use screens in this way. So they use screens as a kind of reward because they know their children love them so much. They're like, if you do your lessons in inverted commas, or maybe not even in inverted commas, maybe just lessons, then you get your time on your screen. And I wonder how you feel about screens as a kind of motivator in that way.
So that I absolutely wouldn't do, and I've never done. And when I talk about screens with parents, I talk about the way in which we interact with screens and how that can actually kind of corrupt our children's relationship with what they do on screens. So the two things that parents often do, which are basically both marketing techniques, is one, that they make them really scarce. So they'll make them artificially scarce in the sense you can have 30 minutes a day and then that's it. Or, which is exactly how marketers try and get us to buy stuff, basically. They say, only one left, or this discount code only lasts until tomorrow. And then they also use them as rewards. So if you use something as a reward, it will get associated in your brain with the bit of your brain that fires off when you have a reward, and it will start to feel more rewarding. So that's why we like things like gold stars. The gold star in itself doesn't do anything, but it's been associated with well done, good boy, good girl, you've done well, approval. And it's associated with that reward part of your brain firing off. When we do that, we make the thing more attractive. So if you use something as a reward, you need to be aware that you will be making it more attractive to that
You're
child.
stacking up the value.
You're stacking up the value, but also it's more than that. You are, when I say corrupting the relationship, I really mean that, because I think part of what I think is so important about what we can do in home education is that we can allow children to have a really straightforward relationship with what they do. So, for example, if we don't do things like Prodigy Maths or Educational City, where maths is about being rewarded for the stars, they do maths because they really like doing maths and they really enjoy doing maths. And that's kind of, when you see it in self-directed teenagers, it's amazing. You're like, everybody else is sort of plowing through this maths because you've got to do it. And my children are doing maths because they really like it. And it's because I think it's because no one has messed up their relationship with maths. I think when we get in there as adults and we start saying, you've got to do all this, and if you don't do this, I'm going to punish you, and if you do this, I'm going to reward you, we make the relationship between that child and maths about the adult approval and the kind of adult influence, rather than just them and maths. And I think with screens, I think as much as we can step out and let that child have a direct relationship with screens, the better it will be for them long term. So what I mean by that is, if you reward a child by letting them go on a screen, you say, you do all this, then I will let you do this. You make that screen more rewarding for them. Literally in their brain, it will feel more rewarding. And what you mean is that they will start choosing to do that whenever they can, because it's the special thing. I'm trying to think of an example, but anything that's made this kind of special, rewarding thing, they're going to be doing it not because they're thinking, do I really want to play Minecraft now? Is that my best option? Would I rather play Minecraft? Would I rather go outside? Would I rather read a book? Minecraft has this special reward thing about it now, and therefore they're more likely to choose it. So it's not just based on, do I want to play Minecraft? Do you see what I mean? That's what I mean by messing up the relationship. I want my children to be able to say, I'd like to play a video game now, because that is the best thing I can think of to do right now, and I'd really like to do it. And when I've had enough of it, I'll stop. And I actually see them both being able to do that. Now,
the other thing you're doing, of course, is you're devaluing whatever it is that you're having to reward. So you're taking the value out of maths, because you're saying there is no value. I'm going to have to give you the value.
Maths is something to get through so that you get the prize, basically. And that we know from the research that damages the child's relationship with the thing they're doing. So they did these great studies in the 1970s where they rewarded preschoolers for drawing pictures. So it was doing something they already liked doing, drawing pictures, and they gave half of them stickers afterwards to reward them for drawing the pictures, and the other half they didn't. And what they found was that the children who were rewarded for drawing the pictures, once the reward stopped, they drew less pictures than they had before. Yes, wow. This drawing became less intrinsically rewarding for them. And I think that was such a strong finding for me, that I just think, so, I'm always thinking that whenever I'm sort of tempted to think, because rewards are all sorts of different things. It can be approval, it can be kind of well done, even that sort of thing can mean that the child is now no longer doing it because they want to do it. They're doing it because of adult approval, which is, of course, unfortunately, is what happens all the way through school.
That is fascinating, and that is so true. I think for building internal motivation, it's very difficult when you're basically removing that and you're adding in these external motivators all the time.
Yes.
My last question for you, Naomi, is there anything that, as home educating parents using screens ourselves, that maybe we could sort of like think about how we use them, or whether we should be more mindful, or realistically, is it not sort of that relevant, and can we just carry on scrolling our Facebook happily? God knows home education is all over Facebook, so it's difficult not to be on Facebook.
I think it's similar to our children, really. It's about what impact is it having on me, and is it the impact I wanted to have on me. So, and I've had times when Facebook has been an absolute lifeline. If you're at home with children and you can't get out very much, that's your place where you can meet people. And that's been amazing. And really, I don't know what it would have been like to home educate before that was the case. It must have been so different. But I do think that we need to be checking in with ourselves as to, what is this? Is this helping me? Is this making me feel good? Is it not making me feel good? And actually, am I making a real choice here? Or am I just doing it because I don't have anything else to do? Like I noticed when my children were younger, I spent a lot of time scrolling on Facebook. And one of the reasons was that because they needed me such a lot of the time, I could never really do things that I would have liked to be doing, like reading a book, because I couldn't guarantee that I would have enough time to finish the page.
Exactly. You have to snatch your moments.
Yeah,
right?
You've got just those teeny moments. You can read a couple of posts on Facebook, but you can't sink into anything. And that's hard. And I think when I recognized that, actually that helped me, because it meant I could think, okay, this is why I'm on Facebook all the time. There was no point in beating myself up about that, because it was a reality of the situation that I was constantly interrupted about stuff, but it wasn't making me feel good. It didn't help me I didn't feel like those moments that I was snatching, they didn't feel like good moments. They didn't feel like sort of replenishing moments. So I thought to myself, a bit like with my children, it's like, how can I meet that need somehow, some other way? And actually what I came up with was I learned how to crochet. And one of the reasons I learned how to crochet is partly because it was learning a new skill, which I liked. I like doing something with my hands, but also you can put it down at any moment. It doesn't matter. You can abandon it and nothing comes unraveled or anything. So I was just looking for little things I could do like that. And I actually found some games as well that I could have on my phone, which were good games. The other thing I found myself doing was spending time on things like Candy Crush, which were like, I think it's a bit like your Son and Prodigy Maths. They're kind of rewarding, but there's nothing there.
It's like drinking Coca-Cola, isn't it?
There's nothing. It's like, you don't feel good after doing it. So I actually did the same things I'd done with my son, which is I went and looked for some really good, high quality games things I liked. And I also like problem solving, and I like board games. So I did things like got Carcassonne, which is a board game on my
yes, I love
phone,
Carcassonne.
and other board games that I could play, which again were games I could just do a couple of moves and then I could abandon it. So I was specifically looking for things to meet that need, so that I was feeling replenished by that little tiny moments of time I had off, rather than doing what I was doing, which was scrolling.
One thing I found at a very similar age, actually, that really transformed my personal involvement in home education, I suppose, or in how I was home educating the children, was I was doing exactly the same thing. I thought, well, I have no idea how long this moment is going to last, so I won't start anything.
Yeah.
And I decided, you know what, I'm just going to have to start starting things, because otherwise I'm never going to do them. The children must have been about 7 or 8, and I thought, you know what, even if I have a minute, I'm just going to do something that matters to me. And I started doing that. And actually, I started crocheting at exactly the same kind of time as
It's funny.
Fellow crocheters.
Yeah, I never got very good, I have to say, but that's all right.
I think I've gifted crochet blankets to everybody I've ever met. Like random people walking down the street, please take it off me. I've got so many of them.
Yeah.
But I found that if I started things, even if I got interrupted, it was okay. And I found also that when the children knew what I was doing, they interrupted me less, because they saw that I was doing something vaguely worthwhile, I suppose. Yeah. The other thing I heard, which I've used ever since I read it, was that if you're on your phone, it's helpful to tell your children what you're doing on it, because they have no idea you could be doing anything on it. So I'm doing things for them, organizing play dates or researching exams for them, things like that. And so what I do now is I sort of say things like, oh, I'm just having a look for a good exam for you, or I'm trying to find a volunteering activity for you. It makes them feel that I'm not just visible. Yeah, and it involves them in the process a bit more, because they are quite exclusive, aren't they, phones? They exclude the people around you a little bit.
They can be. I mean, the other thing I did was played games a lot with my children. Was I was on my phone, connected, so I would have Minecraft and we would play together across platforms, which was really good. But yes, I think there's something interesting you've said there also about the acknowledging that you're going to be interrupted, but it's still worth doing something. I think that's quite an important step. And maybe that, I think it's around 7 or 8 that I was able to do that as well. Because when they're younger, it's so, you almost don't have time to even think about something like doing crochet, do you? Because it's just so all immersive. And I remember actually trying to start doing something with wool when my daughter was a bit younger, and it was quickly clear that was not going to be an option, because she was at the stage where she just was like, great, can I come in and unravel all your wool? So they have to be at a particular stage to be able to do that. The other thing I found helpful was being able to listen to podcasts. So I started just having headphones. I could just say, I'm just going to do this. I put it in, because they were often also maybe had their headphones on. So it felt like that I could just have a little bit of time, or listen to an audiobook where I could just sink into another world for a moment and have a little bit of space, and then I'll come back.
Crocheting and listening to audiobooks is probably my favourite way to pass the time, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, but I like the idea of showing them what you're doing. I used to be aware that I used to read books sometimes. I have a Kindle, and sometimes I would read books on the Kindle app on my phone. And I realized that they weren't seeing that I was reading books, because it didn't look like I was reading books. So I would say to them, I'm reading a book now, and I would say, we can read a book on your iPad if you want to get, so that was, they knew what kind of thing was going on.
Yeah, I find that even now when the children are older, they've always read a lot, but obviously as they get older and older, they read less and start, gaming a bit more. But even now, if I'm reading on my Kindle, I will say, do you want to come into the sitting room? We'll all read together. And we all just sit in our separate chairs reading together, sort of nice. Quietly. Yeah. And it's parallel play, isn't it? Where you're all just kind of doing your own thing in the same reading. Room. Yes. Yeah, it's very lovely. Well, Thank you so much, Naomi. That has been brilliant. And it's been a really helpful look at just some of these distinctions between protection and control and autonomy versus sort of keeping your child safe. So it's been a really eye-opening conversation for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been really nice.
Thank you so much for joining us for today's Home Education Matters podcast. See you at the next one. Have a lovely day.